Sargon's taking a bit of a battering from all quarters at the moment, and I think the degree of stress that can cause is leading to a certain degree of kind of... It's contributing to the gaffes and so on that he's making, basically, I think. So normally I wouldn't like to kind of jump on board with that kind of mob mentality while it's going on, but there's something that Sargon does that pisses me off to the point that I can't really stay quiet on it anymore, and that's his attitude towards Europe. It doesn't seem to matter how much harm Brexit is doing, it doesn't seem to matter how much damage it's doing economically, socially. It doesn't seem to matter to him how the Tories are taking Brexit as some kind of carte blanche to sell off the NHS and take away benefits from disabled people and, you know, pursue this really, really hard right agenda that they're pursuing. It doesn't seem to bother him that the margin of victory was so small, yet the amount of Brexit that we're getting is the hardest, most destructive. And it's just pisses me off, especially when he dismisses it all as middle-class angst. I know I have the accent of a reasonably upper middle-class person, but that's due to having teachers as grandparents and parents. I'm not middle-class, I don't make a lot of money. I have lots of friends who aren't really middle-class, who have married across borders and so on, and I see how all this is affecting them. I've got friends in various businesses who are telling me that, you know, shit is going down. There have been stealth layoffs. There are companies weighing up moving to Europe. Places like Poland even, all because of this mess that we're in. And rather than entering a note of caution or showing a degree of skepticism or having a second thought, because, you know, maybe all these scientists and people who are decrying Brexit, the kind of people that we would normally listen to in other situations, maybe they have a point. Maybe they have a point.
Thought you'd seen all of the insufferable, cringeworthy, middle-class anguish over Brexit that is possible? Well, think again. This is Stop the Silence.
It's not all middle class, and it's not all gonna stay middle class. There's all the retirees and workers who moved to Europe whose future is now uncertain. A lot of pensioners are thinking about moving back. My father retired to the south of France. He's now bought property over here as a kind of safeguard and a way to get back. The drop in the pound has severely affected people living abroad, including pensioners and so on. You may see some tiny reduction in people coming over here from Europe and elsewhere. It's unlikely, even with the draconian measures that are being brought in against immigration, but that will pale into insignificance to the numbers of pensioners moving back here, and they're going to put even more of a strain on the NHS than any number of fit Polish builders are ever going to do. The drop in the value of the pound, we've been insulated from that for a while, as companies like Tesco, for example, have sucked up the loss to their profits. That's not going to last forever. It's already creeping in fuel. That's slowly going up. Food is going to go up. Who is this going to hit the hardest? The poorest. So this angst is just from people who have the foresight to see what's coming and to be worried about it. To dismiss it as middle-class wankery from people who might lose their second home in Brittany or something is to miss the point entirely. This is going to hurt everyone, and ironically it's going to hurt people who in the majority voted for it the hardest.
I don't exist.
I am one.
Of an entire population.
That the government says does not exist.
Right. That's Theresa May saying, oh, there are 65 million people who are backing Brexit. Foolishly thinking that these people would actually think, well, okay, we lost the vote, we lost the referendum, but we do want to make our country a success, so we have to do our very best. No, these are the people who do not want us to do our very best.
Our very best would be to reverse this disastrous decision. Our second best would be to soften Brexit as much as possible, to retain as many of the benefits and so on of European membership as possible, including free movement and free trade. But no, that's not what the government's pursuing. And as to support for Brexit, basically we were split into thirds. 1/3 wanted to stay within Europe, 1/3 wanted to leave, 1/3 didn't give a toss either way. But that 1/3 that didn't give a toss is being claimed by either side. Well, they didn't care. So that basically means we're down to a virtually 50-50 split between people who wanted to leave and people who wanted to remain. And we know that the majority of people who, well, not the majority, we know that a goodly chunk of the people that voted to leave were voting on things that Europe had fuck all to do with, or on spurious nonsense like sovereignty, which doesn't even mean anything in this context, about immigration that us being in or out of Europe really makes no difference to, because it doesn't make any difference to non-EU migration. You know, we know, we've done the analyses on this, and we know, this isn't to disparage people, but we know that the people who voted to leave did tend to be less educated and various other factors like that. So we know they were less informed, less capable of making the decision. That doesn't mean that they shouldn't be involved, but when you count in all the lies and nonsense, the 350 million for the NHS and all the other bullshit that was put out there, it's got to raise questions. It has to raise issues about the conduct of the campaign and what people were told and why they voted the way they did. And polls since have shown that the vote has at least reversed, and that is even taking account for margin of error. There's grounds for a second vote now that everyone knows that it's all shit. That it's causing us so much damage as a country, in terms of prestige, in terms of trade, in terms of jobs, in terms of society, in terms of giving the Tories this apparent free rein to fuck everything over as much as possible. So why, Sargon, are you supporting this? Why? Can't you see the damage? What convinced you? I saw you argue with Thunderfoot, and that's one of the rare occasions I think you've come off absolutely the worst. You took a vicious drubbing in that debate, and it was sad to see, because normally you're better. Is there some kind of ideological bias here? I am biased in favour of Europe. You know, so here I'm providing a counterpoint from a bias in the other direction, perhaps. Maybe the truth lies somewhere in the middle. Maybe it doesn't. But the fact is that the margin was incredibly narrow. This kind of constitutional change in any other country that does this kind of stuff regularly requires a 2/3 majority. Certainly we have a lot of people who didn't want any kind of Brexit whatsoever. We have other people who did want a Brexit, but didn't have the option to express how much of a Brexit they wanted. Do you really think all of these people are 100% behind this most ruinous, most destructive form of leaving Europe that we're now engaged in? I don't think so. I think if we had a vote again today, it would at least go the other way. At least. And certainly people are not 100% behind this total withdrawal. There's absolute disconnection. It's so destructive. It's so stupid. There's just no way around it. That's what it is. It's dumb.
I am a citizen of nowhere.
No, you're a citizen of Britain. You're not a citizen of Europe, because Europe isn't a state.
It's a bit like saying that there's no such thing as a citizen of the United States of America, only a citizen of Florida or Oregon or whatever. You can hold citizenship of two things simultaneously. I'm an English citizen and a British citizen, and currently a European citizen, and I regard myself as a citizen of the world, a step towards which Europe was. People are being stripped of their citizenship of Europe without their consent. That seems like a bad thing to me, doesn't it? To impose something of that level of seriousness, to strip them of their rights as a citizen of a political entity without their consent. That seems pretty shitty, really, doesn't it?
I am one.
Of 29 million people that did not vote for this.
And you're still a minority, because that's how democracy works. We had the referendum, an overwhelming majority of people wanted it, and let's be fair, you're one of 16 million, not 29 million. The people who didn't vote on purpose.
One of the important differences between ochlocracy, which is mob rule, and democracy, which is what we're supposed to be under, though people can argue the toss over that, is that democracy protects its minorities. That democracy is committed to representing all of its people, not just the majority view. So, mob rule is the traditional two wolves and a sheep voting over what's for dinner. That's autocracy. Democracy would be they all vote, and even if they voted to have the sheep for dinner, then the democracy would say, well, no, we have to guarantee the rights of the sheep, so we can't do that, but let's all share a goat. Something like that. You know, it's a way of finding compromise, trying to both represent but also protect, to find compromises in ways that keep everyone at least mildly happy. In this case, of the people who voted, it's virtually 50-50. Half the people wanted some kind of Brexit, half the people didn't want any kind of Brexit whatsoever. And yet we're going for the hardest possible version of Brexit possible. Yeah, that's not democratic. It's not taking into account the views of that sizable minority in this non-binding advisory referendum that we had. So what should have probably been done is to take that into account and perhaps have gone, okay, we're going to go back and we're going to renegotiate with Europe again. And then you would have a fairly hefty bat to swing around when you went and did that. You could go back and say, okay, look, we need concessions, we need change, we need more transparency, we need more democratic reform. Otherwise, our populace narrowly wants to pull out of Europe. That would be an opportunity to force some pretty significant reform. But we've squandered it. Even without that, if we say, okay, well, people want to leave, but it's a very narrow majority and it's only advisory and so on. Okay, we're going to pull out, but only to the extent that some of these other attached nations have done. So we'll pull out of some things, but we'll have to stay in the free market and keep the freedom of movement and so on. So a kind of half-half compromise. You know, we'll take back some rights that we never really lost anyway, and we'll pull out a bit, but you know, we'll retain contact and stay strongly allied with Europe. That's what this result should have resulted in, because that's the compromise between the two positions. One of those two actions. You know, you can't just write off half the population like that. And to say that you should ignore a minority, even especially in the case when it's such a huge minority, virtually half of the people that voted, is just absurd. That's like saying we should roll back rights for any other minority or refuse to take them into account. Like, we should strip black people of their right to be elected as representatives or to vote, whatever. After all, they're a minority, so we don't need to care about what they say. And they're a much smaller minority than the people who voted to remain. It's just absurd and undemocratic to do this.
For price hikes.
For hate crimes.
Oh yeah, that's good. Because otherwise, there are a lot of people who were voting for price hikes and hate crimes. Not that there have been many particular price hikes. I haven't seen anything yet. And the spike in hate crimes was in double figures, wasn't it? Not exactly an enormous problem.
The hate crimes thing is largely bollocks, and probably mostly accounted for through heightened sensitivity, which should make us concerned about the normal level of hate crimes rather than anything else. But still, I agree, we can dismiss that one. The price hikes, though, as I said before, we've been insulated from it. So far, the companies have been sucking up the damage. If you watch the news, if you read the papers, if you look at company statements and so on, you can see that they're not going to be able to do that for very much longer. So we're looking at, if I remember correctly, something in the region of 20% price hike spread out over time, as much as possible. That is terrible. That is going to be awful. And who is it going to hit the hardest? The poorest in our society. Not the rich, who are going to be insulated from it. Who's going to get hit the hardest? The very people that voted for Brexit on the basis of lies and nonsense. They're going to be the ones hurt. Are they going to be smart enough to realise that they made a mistake? Or is blame going to be shifted? Are people like Farage going to blame Europe for the pain that we're going to experience? They probably are, but it's self-inflicted by our own people. It was turkeys voting for Christmas. It was nonsense. You know, the EU reinvested a lot of money back into the UK, particularly in our deprived areas. That's gone. Prices are going to go up, fuel's going to go up, which will in turn impact on prices of things like food and so on, anything that needs to be distributed. We're going to be screwed for a long time, and it's entirely self-inflicted by people like Boris Johnson and Farage misleading people and playing man of the people when they're anything but. It's painful to watch this happen. It's especially painful when people who should know better, like you, Sargon, have bought into this hook, line and sinker and don't seem to have any regard for who it's going to hurt and how much it's going to hurt them and how much damage it's going to do to us, and potentially international damage as well. We've really hurt Europe by doing this at a time when it should be federating more strongly to become a stronger power bloc to help balance against America and Russia and China. That's not going to happen now, is it? We're fucked.
To lose my funding.
Too bad.
But yeah, too bad that a country that basically leads the way in a lot of ways on technology and innovation, and whose only other sectors are really service and banking, are about to lose most of the banking and access to a huge amount of technological funding and investment from which we used to profit massively. Yeah, too bad for us. That fucks the country again. This is not good. This is not something you can just brush off. The loss in science funding, the loss in access to facilities, the loss in capacity for innovation. These are not things you can just brush off with too bad. These are things we have to wrangle with. And do you really think the Tories are going to reinvest in these areas to anything like the same degree? No, they're not.
To lose my business.
Okay, really? Is that the fact? Because, I mean, people in Romania didn't vote for that either. People across Eastern Europe who have oppressive EU regulations, actually, like, legislating their businesses out of existence, didn't vote for that either. Good thing you got a referendum.
What repressive legislation? This was something you couldn't answer before. There's standardization, but what repressive legislation? And, some controls and standards are good. Drinking water. It's a good idea to have that actually be drinkable without killing you. We need only look at the states and Flint, Michigan to see problems there. Is that the kind of state we want in Europe? I really don't think so. Some kind of standards are important, and if you're a singular trading bloc, common standards are important. That hasn't really harmed anyone. And the drop in the pound is putting people out of business. It is forcing layoffs. It is forcing people to think about relocating. None of this is good for the country. Again, you can't just brush this shit off. Lots of people voted with no regard for the consequences whatsoever. They didn't know what the consequences were. They were sold sunshine and rainbows and blinded by bulldogs and Union Jacks. Some kind of petty nationalism, which is identity politics, which you're against. It's also collectivism, which you're against. What the fuck, man? What the fuck?
To lose my job.
Again, yeah. It's all Brexit. I mean, despite the fact there have been thousands of new employment opportunities due to mass investment, due to the devaluation of the pound.
Those opportunities don't really exist yet. Companies are having to be bribed and cajoled into staying here rather than pulling out. This hasn't been a fantastic opportunity. We don't have a lot of exporting businesses. Our manufacturing and so on has been gutted over the last 50 years or so. Absolutely gutted. If we still had that kind of light industrial base at least, then maybe we could make something better of this. But we don't. And the only way to build that up would be nationalisation and massive social investment. How likely is that under a hard right Tory government? People are losing their jobs. I know tech companies that have stealthily had 10% layoffs. That are talking about moving to Eastern Europe because it's just better the way things are now. We are seeing a certain degree of vulture capitalism because they sense that Britain is weak, and that's creating a certain false inflation of stocks and various other aspects. But for actual people on the ground, nothing good is happening. Nothing good is going to happen. The same people that always profit from shit are going to profit, and you have to be wealthy to have the opportunity to profit from that. That's not most people.
To lose my rights.
You haven't lost any fucking rights. I'm retaining my calm. You haven't lost any rights. You lost a vote. Deal with it.
We will be losing a lot of rights. Perhaps one of the most significant is free movement, which has enabled people from different countries to fall in love, to get married across borders, and now all of that is up in the air, especially in light of the increasingly draconian restrictions on marriages and so on across international lines outside Europe, the increase in the amount of money you're supposed to earn and so on. And this has left a lot of people in the lurch. I'm in an international marriage. My wife's American. We have had several panics over changes already, and we see what's going on in Europe and the changes that are going on there. And I have friends who are international couples living in Europe, living over here. Their entire future is up in the air, and it doesn't seem to matter how long you've been married, if you're married, if you have children, anything like that. It's all open to question. You know, the right, surely you have the right to be with the person you love, to set up a life together, to set up a home together, you know, to raise children together, to invest in the country that you live in and its future. To that extent, surely that grants you an unassailable right to remain in that country. And yet we have people who have been granted leave to remain being excluded. You know, there's increased scrutiny across the board. Because they couldn't control European immigration, they've made non-European immigration much harder. You know, and this increases resentment towards a lot of immigrants, because the people that do bother to go through all the legal hoops, all the invasive investigations into your past and your relationships and the business attachments in the country and everything, the people who, you know, go through all those hoops and jump through it all and do everything that's needed and required of them, can still arbitrarily, apparently on a whim, be rejected, while other people just seem to waltz in without having to do any of that. You know, that increases resentment and problems towards refugees and asylum seekers and migrants of all kinds, because people who do bother to go through the process end up resenting them as much as some natives do. You know, and there's good reason for that. But again, the loss of free movement, that is a massive impact on families, on society. It's a huge rolling back of what is an increasingly wired up and wired in world that we all live in, where these kind of relationships and friendships and romances and so on occur internationally more and more and more, and yet we're taking this massive step back to a more primitive, isolationist, nationalistic point of view, which simply isn't compatible with the modern telecoms world that we exist in, the modern internationalist world that we live in. And that's not the only right that's under threat. Part of the reason Theresa May, even though she campaigned Remain, has been so pro-leave, is that she often felt frustrated by Europe, that she wasn't able to just violate people's human rights on a whim. The EU has been massively good for human rights, and has been massively good for stopping governmental overreach against your rights here. The EU guarantees workers' rights far more than we ever had here. You know, part of the reason so many people are rubbing their hands together in glee at the prospect of Brexit is not through some kind of resurgent British exceptionalism or a belief that Britain can make its own way. No, they see a potential to exploit our workers. She wants to pull out of the European Court and everything else that's attached. She wants to roll back workers' rights. That's going to cause massive harm. Europe has also given us protections against monopolies. It was anti-TPP. You know, Europe is far more to the left and far more liberal in a lot of ways than aspects of Britain are. It's also much more democratic as a whole. I mean, even the EU, much as people decry it, is more democratic than our home system, more representative of our public's views in a lot of ways. And yet we're pulling out of it. That's going to leave us at the mercy of monopolies. It's going to leave us at the mercy of an end to net neutrality. It's going to allow corporations to run roughshod. It's going to roll back what remaining workers' rights there are, since Thatcher basically deunionized us. The harm, and again, to normal working people, is going to be enormous. Enormous.
To lose my neighbour.
Your neighbour could move at any time. You don't have a right to keep the same neighbour.
She's obviously talking about European citizens being forced to leave. Don't be a shit.
My friends.
My family.
My belief in politicians.
Fucking what? A, your friends and family, they're not dying. And I don't even think they're going to have to leave the country, so calm your shit down. But your belief in politicians? Who the fuck has a belief in politicians? What kind of naive children have belief in politicians?
Any political system is dependent upon people's belief in that system. Even a dictatorship, with all its apparatus to instill fear and so on, the moment that loses the confidence or fear of the people, it's fucked. Our democracy is fucked if people lose their belief in it. Now, you can argue that Brexit and so on was a backlash of a working class, a lower class, an underclass that had lost faith in the political system whatsoever. A lot of them did vote that don't normally vote. And therein lies the problem for the future, I think, because they're unlikely to vote in the future as well. And the people who do more regularly vote were much more likely to be pro-Remain. So moving forward into elections to come, we're much more likely to see a shift the other way of people voting for MPs and so on, who are much more pro-European. And yet, only the Liberal Democrats seem to have noticed this trend and seem to be exploiting it to great effect after their previous decimation. Isn't that odd? But yet, like I say, any government is dependent upon people's belief in that system, and that they're willing to go along with it, that they believe that it ultimately, at least some of the time, has their best interests at heart. And a lot of people's belief in our political system has now been shaken. And historically, politically, our system is failing at the moment. It's less democratic than the EU was, which was a big complaint that a lot of people had, yet there's no traction for reform of our home political system. The things that it's meant to do, such as deal with problems like Brexit and sometimes even override the public will for the greater good, it has manifestly failed to do. Our system is distorted. It has MPs running scared, refusing to lead, refusing to explain, refusing to make arguments. Very few MPs were willing to rebel on these issues. It's interesting, though, to look at how the Lords has rejected the current bill going through. I don't like the Lords. I think it needs reform. I think it needs reform desperately. But it's interesting to see how removing that populist pressure gives the Lords a certain amount of free rein to do what they believe is right, even in the face of public opinion, even in the face of Parliament. It's interesting to note, if there's some way we can preserve some of that while reforming the Lords and making it more democratic, then I'd be all for that. But it swings and roundabouts, it goes both ways. But yes, if people's belief in the system is shaken, and if it's shaken amongst people who typically form the voting class, for want of a better word, that is deeply troubling and does not bode well for our future.
In democracy.
This is democracy in action. You participated when you said, I will vote, and I will abide by the results. You wouldn't want it changed if you'd won the referendum, and you're not going to have it changed now you lost it.
No, that's not democratic. That's mob rule, as I went over earlier. A democracy takes into account the views of its minorities, and should especially take them into account when it's nearly 50% of the people who voted on an issue. absolutely it should take that into account, and it's not. There are other reasons why someone's faith in democracy might have been shaken by Brexit. Mine certainly was. The ease with which people were fed disinformation, the reasons they gave for voting leave that had fuck all to do with the EU, people's sheer level of ignorance about the EU and how it operates, the amount of nonsense from newspapers like Straight Bananas and all this bullshit that they believed and helped shape the reason that they voted. You know, democracy relies upon an informed populace, not a misinformed populace. You know, that's shaken my belief in the average Joe as being informed enough to deal with these issues. I'm still struggling with that. The same with Trump. If the populace is misinformed, not informed, if leaders won't lead, if they'll only follow whim, if they won't do what's necessary to secure our future and to make decisions for the greater good, then what use are they? There's historical examples of cases where government has gone against popular opinion for the greater good, where more informed people, expert opinion, has shaped policy against public opinion, but has turned out to be the right way to do things. The repeal of the death penalty is probably the best go-to example of this. It remained popular amongst the general populace for years and years and years. It's only recently that I believe it's dropped below 50%. But lawyers and judges, statisticians and so on all looked at the issue and realized that it was cruel and unusual, that it did no good, it had no deterrence effect, that the wrong people were being killed, and decided to repeal it. And we've come around to realizing that was the best thing. Pretty much every expert you care to mention was pro-Remain, and everything that's happened has only proved them right. Even the former Greek finance minister, and people often point to Greece as a reason why we should leave the EU, but even he understands and says that we would have been better off staying in. Different circumstance, different country, different issue, different conclusion. That's skepticism. That's applying rationality.
For brutal Brexit.
Brutal. Yes, hard Brexit. Completely out. Return the sovereignty of Britain to Britain. Like every other nation. That is a good thing.
What does it even mean? People keep talking about sovereignty as though it were meaningful rather than just a kind of noise that people make. Or why did you want to leave Europe? Sovereignty. What sovereignty did we lose? We democratically entered into Europe, we democratically participated in Europe, we agreed with over 80% of the decisions made in Europe. Britain went along with them and voted along with them. What sovereignty did we lose? We were participating within a greater political structure. If you're going to make that argument, then you should be pro-Scottish independence, you should be pro-Welsh independence, you should be pro-Cornish independence. Where does it stop? At what degree does it stop? I mean, ideologically, I'm an anarchist, so I think every person should have complete personal sovereignty and independence to the extent that that's possible. But we don't live in a utopia, we live in the real world. We have to deal with the hand that we're dealt. We have to deal with nation states and power blocks and geopolitics and all the rest of that shit that stops us getting somewhere utopian, except in incremental steps. But overall, Europe was better for my personal rights, your personal rights, everyone's personal rights. Nobody voted for a hard Brexit. They voted for a Brexit, narrowly, in an advisory referendum that was never legally binding. That was just meant to inform the government of public opinion so that they could then move forward and decide what to do. Not this mess that we find ourselves in. That was never voted for. There is no mandate here for a hard Brexit. And there's certainly no mandate for the hard right agenda that the Tories are pushing, that Theresa May is pushing. There's no mandate for that. There's no mandate for a hard Brexit. The sheer numbers of people that didn't want any kind of Brexit should be moderating and softening the Brexit that we're doing. even eliminating it because public opinion has changed. We should still be fighting this, and yet you're bemoaning these people. These people are looking at the situation and saying that this is shit, we need to do something about it. They are looking at the evidence of what's happened, of how right the Remain campaign was while it was arguing. You're blinded by something, and I can't quite make out what it is. I mean, surely you're not nationalistic, because that's identity politics and collectivism, two things that you're staunchly against. You talk about sovereignty without really defining what it means. You talk about burdensome regulations without being able to name any. You don't seem to be weighing up the economic benefits. What was it? It's something like for every pound we put into the EU, we were essentially making £10, and all that's going to be lost. I can't remember exactly what that was. Someone, I'm sure, will correct me in the comments. But you know, it was an investment that was worth it. You know, you've often talked about being anti-globalism, and while it may seem counterintuitive, the European courts, the European culture was very much anti-monopoly and very much softened globalism. Whereas now Theresa May seems to want to turn us into some sort of offshore tax haven just off the shores of Europe, strip away workers' rights, strip away personal rights, and turn us into an exploitable nation that's going to be deeply entrenched in corporatism and much less protected from globalism. So what the hell's going on there? What? Any objective assessment of the facts, of the statistics, of the cost benefit of being in or out of Europe should, I think, inevitably lead someone to the conclusion that we were better off in and should remain in and should continue to campaign to remain in right up until the last second. I don't see what facts, what remote objective examination of these issues, of these statistics, of the forecasts, of any of the available data could lead one to think that we're better off out. All I ever seem to hear is this vague waffling about sovereignty, whatever that even means, how we ever lost it when we were involved in a democratic structure, that we democratically decided to hand over certain legislative powers to. That was our choice, that was our sovereign choice. What are you even talking about, and why are you pro it? I can't seem to drill down to anything other than some kind of vague nationalism, which doesn't make sense knowing what else I know about you. So why? Why?
I didn't vote for this.
Too bad.
We didn't vote for this.
Yes, that's how it works. There are things I didn't vote for I have to live with. I've already explained this. Jesus Christ, what the hell is this fucking complaint against democracy all of a sudden?
And again, this isn't democracy. This is mob rule. This is autocracy, not democracy. You cannot simply ignore these people, not with such a tiny, tiny majority, since at least reversed. There's no mandate for a hard Brexit. There's a slim mandate for some sort of Brexit, but not what we're getting, not all the effects that lots of people don't seem to have been aware of, especially in the context of people being so thoroughly lied to and swallowing it hook, line and sinker. As reality sets in, people have changed their minds. People are changing their minds. People are seeing that they were sold a lie. So how do we deal with that? Is it always just one vote and that's it forever? Then I don't know, what was the first democratically elected government? Are we stuck with them ad infinitum into the future? Or do we have another election every so many years? Do we have opportunities for rethinking and changing course and so on? So why not have that here as reality sets in, as Brexit starts to bite, as people start to get regrets? As the truth about it sets in. I mean, it almost set in immediately with the lies about promises of money and so on, didn't it? I seem to recall pretty much immediately after the vote, people on the pro-Brexit side being pressed on this issue and backing down on everything. Oh no, we didn't really mean to promise that. No, it's just a possibility. Bollocks. People were lied to. People deserve to be able to continue to campaign against this, to continue to pressurise and try to persuade. That is part of democracy. There's no reason why you should have to go along with it any more than anyone should have to go along with any of Trump's executive decisions or any particular policy that May brings in. You know, just because the majority, probably not actually, looking at the percentages, voted in a Conservative government doesn't mean you have to go along with them dismantling the NHS. Whatever. Oh, well, that's what most people voted for. Oh, then most people voted to impale me up the rectum with a spike. Well, who am I to argue against that? Spike away, good fellow, spike away.
The people are speaking. Is Parliament listening? No, because they're listening to a majority that put them there.
A slim majority, since more than reversed, of people who were lied to, of people, many of whom do not normally vote in elections. This is an excuse to push a particularly nasty hard-right agenda. They are tacking everything else on the back of Brexit. People were lied to, people were misinformed, people have changed their minds. As Brexit bites, more and more people will change their minds. You don't just give up and go home, necessarily, when you lose, especially by such a tiny margin, and especially when the stakes are so high and the damage is so great. That's when you fight. We overcame the poll tax, potentially we could overcome this.
Do you understand that Conservatives won on a mandate of running the EU referendum, and they got a majority, and then they got them there. They did the referendum as promised, which is quite shocking, and that won with a clear majority as well. The people have spoken.
Only 2/3 of the population voted in the 2015 election, and only 2/3 of the population voted in the Brexit referendum. Of that 2/3, only about 1/3 voted Conservative in the last election. So they by no means have a majority. They did not have over 50% of the vote. Have over 50% of Parliament, that's a whole other kettle of fish and a much bigger problem. When it comes to Brexit, only barely 50% of that 2/3 that voted for Brexit. They did not vote for what kind of Brexit. There's a lot of people that didn't vote at all, weren't interested, didn't care, didn't think it made a difference either way. But virtually half of those people didn't want any kind of Brexit. Again, this is not democratic to completely dismiss out of hand all these people. And the Conservatives by no means have a mandate for the kind of agenda that they're pushing, even on the back of Brexit. Brexit does not have a mandate for the degree and extremity to which it is being driven. I don't think you understand democracy as it's supposed to operate. You seem to mistake it for mob rule over and over and over again. Democracy is not merely majority rule. It's meant to be moderated, it's meant to be cushioned, softened, there are meant to be checks and balances, and it's meant to be able to act independently of the popular will where necessary. And all of these aspects of democracy that make it superior in some ways to direct mob rule, these appear to be failing, and you appear to be cheering it on. And I wouldn't have thought you would with your historical background.
The argument is over. Remainers deal with it.
No argument is ever truly over, certainly in politics, but even in science, where you have to continue making the case for your discovery and so on, to convince new people, to stand up to the people who are trying to dismantle the argument or present a different alternative theory, and so you refine or you overturn in the face of new evidence. In terms of Brexit, even though a lot of us knew this shit was going to happen, to a lot of people the shit that has been happening constitutes new evidence. So the argument needs to continue to be made. And honestly, I'm yet to have heard any coherent argument in favour of Brexit. I just hear this vague waffling about sovereignty, and I still have no real clue what anyone means by it. Again, it seems to be a meaningless noise. A Churchillian waffle. It's meaningless, nothing. We never lost any sovereignty. What the fuck are you talking about? And all these other issues that people bring up, nothing to do with the EU. Non-EU migration, fuck all to do with us. Legislation, that's such a terrible imposition on our businesses. Well, What legislation? What constrictions? Well, what are the ones you're fussing about, and why are they such an imposition to us and not such a massive imposition to other people in Europe? What the fuck are you talking about? It's not that Europe doesn't have issues, but we're better placed within Europe to reform it and change it and make it something better, aren't we? You need to continue to make the argument, and we will continue to make the argument against, even if it's just to soften the harm, even if it's just to force government to reinvest in the areas that are going to be fucked over by what's going on. Even if that's all we have, we'll do that. But why? Given your grounding in the classics, given your grounding in history, given your status as a skeptic and a rationalist, given your opposition to collectivism and identity politics, why would you buy into this? Why would you buy into mob rule? Why would you buy into nationalism? Why would you buy into collectivism? Why would you ignore all the harm that's being done, the damage that's being done to our country and to the world by this, and continue to back it? Why would you state that the argument is over in the way that social justice warriors do about various things that we rail against and continue to argue against? Why would you do the same thing? I don't get it. What is your pro-Brexit argument, and why have you compromised all these stances and all this knowledge in service to it? Now, I acknowledge that I am biased to be pro-Europe for a number of personal and other reasons. I don't understand where your bias is coming from. I'm trying to present a balancing view here, but I don't know. Someone explain it to me. I'm sorry I keep using this outro, but it keeps being relevant. Saying,
when I was just a baby, my mama told